On November 11th, 2010, in the quaint, lovely town of Apple Valley, Ohio, law enforcement officers entered a family's residence who had been reported missing. There was blood everywhere. Blood spatter sprayed the walls and crept down to the edges of the floor. Bloody drag marks ran from the living room into the bedroom, down the hallway, and into the bathroom. Inside, officers were met with a bloodbath, but there were no bodies in sight. Who and where were these victims, and who was the monster that caused this family massacre? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. This particular episode contains many trigger warnings: child abuse, suicidal thoughts, animal abuse. This is the case of the Leaf Killer. On November 10th, 2010, law enforcement officers received a call from a concerned manager at the local Dairy Queen, whose employee, Tina Herman, did not show up for her shift that day. She stressed at the police that this was highly out of character for her to do, and she mentioned how the woman had just broken up with her boyfriend, Greg Borders, who could be a real jerk to her. Around 7:25 p.m. that evening, an officer conducted a wellness check at the residence of the single mother of 2 kids, but nothing seemed amiss, so he left and went back on patrol. The following morning, the boyfriend of another woman, 41-year-old Stephanie Sprang, who happened to be a friend of Tina's, called to report her missing. The manager of the Dairy Queen, who had initially called about Tina's disappearance, had mentioned to officers that Tina had 2 young children. They contacted their schools, who informed them that the last time they were seen was when the bus driver dropped them off near their house that Wednesday. Then Valerie, who was the manager at Dairy Queen, went to Tina's house to check on her that same day. The door must have been unlocked, so she slowly went inside. When she entered, she was horrified to see blood everywhere. She immediately called the police to report what she had seen. The officers at the location of the crime would forever be traumatized by the scene of horror that awaited them inside. Blood spatter was everywhere. It decorated the walls with its sinister color in almost every room. Upon entry to the house, officers noticed a large saturated blood stain on the carpet. Trails of blood, which appeared to be drag marks, ran from the living room, down the hallway, and into each of the children's bedrooms. The living room and each of their rooms had 1 foot by 1 foot stains of blood on the floor. There was blood on the pillows, the beds, the walls. Each of the trails of blood converged into the bathroom. When officers entered the bathroom, they were met with a bloodbath. Blood was sprayed across the floor, the toilet, and over the sink. The bathtub was smeared and caked with blood and bits of what were believed to be human tissue. The shower curtain was drenched, weighed down by several inches of blood that skirted its edges. It was clear to crime scene investigators that this was the location of human dismemberment. Then officers noticed that there were 2 visible shoe imprints in the residence. Could there have been more than one perpetrator? One of the shoe prints was of a 7.5 Airwalks tennis shoe, whose box was found in the closet of Tina Herman's 13-year-old daughter, Sarah Maynard. That indicated that she was maybe still alive. Was it possible that she was involved in this horrendous crime? Based on the excessive and grotesque violence of the crime, even the most cynical of detectives had difficulty believing this to be true. The alternative scenario, though, was even more concerning. This monster had taken the young girl. Homicide investigators were now looking for 3 bodies and an abducted teenage girl. Upon further exploration of the residence, crime scene investigators found groceries sitting on the kitchen floor. The victim had no chance of putting them away when she was viciously attacked. Tina Herman's vehicle, a Ford pickup, was also missing. Police focused their efforts on finding the stolen truck. On November 11th, around 6:55 p.m., they located the truck about 7 miles away from the residence, but nothing was inside to give them any answers. Officers located and brought in Tina Herman's boyfriend, Greg Borders, immediately for an interview. He seemed genuinely concerned about her whereabouts. He also stressed to the police that even though they had a tumultuous on-again, off-again type of relationship, nothing had ever become violent between them. His alibi was checked and confirmed against timesheets, video at his warehouse job, and through management. Tina Herman's ex-boyfriend didn't appear to be a suspect any longer. Homicide investigators interviewed several other potential suspects, but nothing panned out. No one in these women's lives appeared to hold any animosity against them. They were both known as kind, generous, hard-working, single mothers. So who would want to hurt them? Officers began to wonder whether this horrific crime had been committed by a stranger. Inside the garage, officers located a Walmart bag with heavy-duty trash bags and 2 tarps inside. If it were a stranger who had committed the murders and abduction, then maybe these items had been bought by the murderer, and bizarrely, he left behind what had been used to dispose of their bodies. There was no receipt, but officers knew with the good surveillance they have at Walmart, there was a good chance they could find their perpetrator. First, they matched the product codes on the bags and the tarps purchased by the cashier who had rang them up, and the exact time they were rung up. Then officers watched store footage of 24 hours before the bodies were discovered. Around midnight on Wednesday, November 9th, a white man between 25 to 40 years old with slim to average build casually walked up to the cashier to make his purchase. There were no visible signs of stress, paranoia, or emotion whatsoever after the atrocities he had just committed. They noticed he also purchased a turkey sandwich. Apparently, this brutal family murderer was hungry after his epic session of dismemberment. Law enforcement officers found this particularly cold and disturbing and indicated clear signs that this criminal was a total psychopath. They watched as the man left the store and drove away in a blue Toyota Yaris. State DMV records and a driver's license pointed officers toward a man named Matthew Hoffman. He was even wearing the same shirt in his license photo as the one he had on at Walmart. One of the officers recognized the suspect when he had spoken with him close to where the truck was found. He had seen Matthew loitering near the abandoned vehicle. When he asked the guy what he was doing there, he said he was waiting for his girlfriend to get off of work. The deputy asked him for the girl's name, but Matthew said he didn't know her last name since they had just started dating, but that her first name was Sarah. At 8 a.m. on November 14th, with a search warrant now secured, a no-knock warrant specifically. Led by Mount Vernon Police Detective Craig Feeney and his partner, SWAT team members burst into the residence of Matthew Hoffman. While one officer pushed through the front door, another threw a flash grenade into the house. When law enforcement officers swarmed the Mount Vernon residence of their prime suspect, they were shocked and disturbed at the scene they encountered. There he slept, peacefully on the couch. Matthew became disoriented and stunned by their arrival. The officers threw him to the floor. He asked them what was going on, acting as if he didn't understand why they were there, and initially resisted being arrested until he calmed down. They placed him into handcuffs and dragged him off to the police station. Meanwhile, other officers began to search his residence, hoping they would find the young girl alive. Then they noticed the most bizarre sight. To the right of the front door was a room covered in layers and layers of leaves. Leaves didn't just cover the floor, but the piles were so thick and high that officers feared there could be someone underneath. They poked around in the leaves, calling out to see if anyone was there. But no one was there except an endless mound of leaves. In the living room sat a 14 by 14 tarp, surrounded by leaves as high as 3 feet. On the walls of the living room were 3 rows of bagged leaves that were hung from the floor up to the ceiling. Even the bathroom was completely insulated by leaves. More than 110 bags of leaves were attached to the walls. The mirror was covered over by a bag of leaves. Even the toilet was surrounded by them. There were no words to describe how bizarre and unsettling Matthew Hoffman's house was. Then in the corner of the house, they spotted what appeared to be a basement door. 4 officers rushed down the stairs and found themselves staring at the entry of a dark hole. When they peered inside, they saw a girl. She was bound and gagged, lying on a high pile of leaves. They yelled out to her, "Are you Sarah?" The girl replied yes, to which the officers responded, "We are not here to harm you. We are here to rescue you." They picked up the young, terrified girl and brought her to the hospital. She revealed to officers that she had been raped. Sarah Maynard was held against her will in the basement for 4 long, terrifying days. Her mother, brother, and family friend were all still missing. Stephanie Spring was very close to her father, and before she vanished, he wasn't aware that anything odd was going on that he should be concerned about. Some of her friends later informed him, though, that she thought someone might be following her. Police worked tirelessly to find a connection between Matthew Hoffman and the 3 missing persons, but they found nothing. Her father was heartbroken and full of rage toward what had happened to his daughter, but he didn't have a face to place that anger at. Officers conducted a wide, extensive search of the area. A helicopter was used by investigators to search over a lake, riverbanks, bike paths, and various areas of a park across from the home of the missing mother, her son, and friend. A sonar-equipped boat was employed to scan below the surface of the lake, and 3 divers searched the water. Nothing was found in connection with the investigation. What had initially been called a missing persons case for days was now being described as a recovery for 3 people. After Matthew Hoffman was arrested for Sarah's abduction, officers located 2 vehicles submerged in a pond near his residence, but there was no evidence in their discovery. Matthew Hoffman said not a word during his initial hearing. His public defender did not enter a plea on his behalf. The suspect was now being held on a $1 million bond on charges of kidnapping a minor. There was no known relationship or connection between him, Sarah Maynard, or her family. However, his parents' home was within walking distance of Tina Herman's. Matthew Hoffman had been watching her home and her family. According to Sheriff Deputy Barber, and I quote, "They knew Hoffman, or Hoffman made himself known to them. He acquainted himself with the family, whether they knew he was acquainting himself with them or not." This is a very ominous way to express how he was likely hunting this family, slowly and meticulously watching their every move. Over the first few days, he was held in jail on charges of kidnapping Sarah Maynard. Matthew Hoffman said barely a word and hardly made an expression. He appeared to be in an almost comatose state. However, according to the Columbia Dispatch, the case files included the following interaction between the defendant and Special Agent Joe Dietz of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation. On Tuesday, November 16th, inside a single-stall restroom, Matthew Hoffman opened up to him off camera. He confessed to Special Agent Dietz that he had a terrible nightmare the night before. Matthew told him that he had been inside a food processing plant when he opened up a trash bag of dismembered body parts. He told him that he could not handle being in prison for life and he did not want to be on medication for schizophrenia. He said he would confess everything to law enforcement agents if they would just let him escape and be shot by one of them. Obviously, Agent Dietz did not agree to these terms, and the next day, nothing was further said by Matthew Hoffman. On the fourth day of his interrogation, one of the lead detectives decided to approach things differently. When one of the investigators stressed to the suspect how there were family members out there who just wanted some closure as to what happened to their loved ones, he looked up at the officer, touched his heart, and then put his hands together, making the hand gesture for broken twice. It was beyond strange and unexpected. When I observed the video, it didn't come off as a genuine emotion, but rather it seemed to me as if he were mocking them. Time was coming to an end when officers could hold him legally without having an attorney present. They needed to get Matthew Hoffman to talk. A few days after he was arrested on charges of kidnapping, Matthew Hoffman's mother went to visit her son in jail. When interviewed by the local news the next day, she spoke of how she believed her visit helped to facilitate him telling the police where they could find the bodies. She claimed that her son said he was relieved when his house was raided by the police because now Sarah could go home. If that is true, how delusional of him to say this when he was the only reason she was being held prisoner in the first place. It seems highly unlikely that he was happy she would be found. This just seems like an attempt to manipulate his mother and by extension the media and the prosecution. I also find it strange that his mother wanted to take credit for his telling the police where the bodies of his victims were. To me, this is indicative of her own narcissism, which likely rubbed off on her son. Matthew Hoffman was now faced with 10 counts, including 3 counts of aggravated murder, 3 counts of gross abuse of a corpse, burglary, kidnapping, and rape. When homicide investigators revealed the evidence they had against him, Matthew Hoffman made a deal with the prosecution to spare his own life. Ohio is a death penalty state, and given the aggravating circumstances of multiple murders committed during the commission of a burglary, in addition to the kidnapping and rape of a minor, Matthew Hoffman, in all likelihood, would have been sentenced to death. In return for avoiding the death penalty, he agreed to plead guilty to all of the charges, including a complete written confession and to direct police to where the 3 bodies were. According to Matthew Hoffman, the following sequence of events occurred on Wednesday, November 9th, 2010. He was in the woods, camped out, watching the house for a couple of days. It was away from other residences that may have prying ears and eyes, so it was ideal. He waited and watched for the prime opportunity to burglarize the home. When he saw the mother leave in her truck, he noticed the opening at the bottom of the garage door and snuck inside. He was not in any rush and took his time looking for items to steal. Then, about an hour later, Tina returned home. She entered the kitchen with grocery bags. He hit her over the head with an item several times, but she was still conscious. Matthew dragged Tina into her bedroom. Then someone else was at the door. It was Stephanie Sprang, whom investigators later learned had planned on searching for a new apartment together that day. Stephanie let herself inside the house, saw him, and began to yell at him. Matthew was confronted by 2 adults now and faced with being caught. He began to panic. He pulled out his hunting knife and stabbed Tina in the back, who was lying on the bed, several times. Stephanie fled for Sarah's bedroom, so he chased after her. He stabbed her multiple times in the chest until she fell to the carpet and bled out. Matthew then dragged both women's bodies into the bathtub, where he dismembered their bodies with his knife. Several hours passed, and then the children returned home from school. He grabbed the young boy who was screaming and stabbed him. The girl had shut herself in her bedroom. He thought he could subdue her, so he pushed the door open, gagged the girl, and tied her up. He carried her to the truck and drove her back to his house. He returned to the Herman home and dismembered her little brother's body. Late that night, he went to Walmart to buy bags and tarps, and then carried their remains to the truck. Matthew drove out to a wildlife area and parked, riding his bike out amongst the vast area of trees to dispose their bodies. It was reported that he also killed the family dog, but when he did this or how, there was no record of it. Even more strange is how not only was this not included in his written confession, but nowhere in the documentary about the case is it even addressed. His initial plan was to torch the truck and the blood-spattered house, but he was interrupted by the officer near the discovery of the truck. On Thursday, November 18th, 5 days after he was arrested, his 3 victims were finally found. Matthew Hoffman instructed police they would discover the bodies at Kokosing Wildlife Preserve, a place that without the defendant's input, the bodies would never have been unearthed. Little did officers realize that the victims' bodies would be located in the most bizarre and unexpected of places. Amidst the breathtaking beauty of endless trees surrounded by the glistening lake, laid a scene so macabre and strange that there was nothing to compare to it before, and there hasn't been since. About a mile into the wooded area, officers stopped when they saw the tree Matthew Hoffman had described to them. A 60-foot beech tree with a knothole about 7 to 8 feet off the ground. When the special agent Joe Dietz climbed up and looked inside the hole, he could see what appeared to be multiple garbage bags at the bottom. Although Matthew Hoffman had asked officers to promise they wouldn't harm the tree. They had to cut several holes into it to remove the victims. What lay inside the hollow tree was beyond morbid and weird. Something from a nightmare. With their hands deep inside the trunk, they began to pull out multiple garbage bags. Garbage bags of human remains that had been purposely and carefully placed deep inside the tree. It was one of the most horrifying tasks investigators had ever been asked to handle. It was believed that Matthew Hoffman utilized his skills as a tree trimmer and used harnesses to haul the remains of the bodies up to the hole at the top of the tree. Then, one by one, he dropped the bags of his victims down to its base. Along with the lodged bodies of Tina Herman, her 11-year-old son Cody, and her close friend Stephanie Sprang, were believed to be the remains of the family dog, who had mysteriously disappeared. Who was Matthew Hoffman, and what could have triggered him to commit such a heinous, unspeakable act of violence? An unemployed tree trimmer, Matthew Hoffman was currently out on parole for an arson offense. In Steamboat, Colorado, he intentionally set the Ridge townhome development ablaze, burning 10 homes in the process, which resulted in $2 million worth of damages. Matthew Hoffman had been burglarizing homes, and he had broken into a place the day before the fire. He had been working as a plumber and had been installing some fixtures inside one of the townhomes when he decided to rob the place. He found an extra key to the residence and stole it. Later, he invaded this home when the homeowner Robert Aguizzi was away, stealing the man's Chevy Suburban in addition to various items inside the house. The next day, he went back and poured 10 gallons of gasoline around its premises and watched it go up in flames. It was later realized that Matthew Hoffman lit the townhomes on fire in an attempt to cover up his involvement in the burglary. The Suburban and stolen items were discovered about a mile down the road. Fortunately, no one was injured in the incident, but 2 townhomes were completely destroyed and 8 others were badly damaged. It was obvious to arson investigators that it was an intentionally set fire. Matthew Hoffman was only 19 at the time this crime was committed. He confessed to the fire, the theft, and also for stealing "Welcome to Steamboat, Colorado" signs. In return for pleading guilty to first-degree arson, the judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison. Matthew Hoffman also pled guilty to second-degree burglary and first-degree aggravated motor vehicle theft. He received 4 additional years for each of these offenses. Another 4 years was stacked onto his sentence for pleading guilty to felony theft, and 6 more months in jail for charges of reckless endangerment, which was a misdemeanor. At the time of his hearing, Matthew Hoffman expressed regret and genuine concern for the welfare of the residents, claiming that looking back on what he did, he would not have set the fire. The district judge presiding, Joel S. Thompson, ordered that Matthew Hoffman's sentences be served concurrently, meaning at the same time. So he had to serve a cumulative total of 8 years in prison. When he was released, he would face 5 years of parole. The deputy district attorney, Charles Feldman, spoke of how Matthew Hoffman had gotten off light for his offense, and he should have been incarcerated for a minimum of 10 years, pointing out the degree of premeditation involved in the act. Matthew Hoffman was released from the Colorado Department of Corrections on January 10, 2007, and remained on parole until October 10, 2010. He was allowed to relocate to Ohio in 2007. Somehow he was approved for a mortgage and purchased a 5-bedroom home. However, he was not regularly employed, so it is unknown how he afforded to live there. Prior to the purchase of his 109-year-old home, his car and the trees were his primary residence. Former neighbors of his described Matthew Hoffman as being a loner, a weirdo, and someone whom they weren't comfortable being around. They claimed his behavior was highly abnormal and bizarre. He would watch them as he sat in the trees. His next-door neighbor, Donna Davis, claimed that at first he seemed to be fine, but then not long after, she wouldn't allow her kids to play outside if he was out there. She described him as being odd, but not necessarily threatening, just strange. He would place a hammock high up in the tree and watch people. He often walked over to the gravel pit with bags, and sometimes he brought the bags back, and other times he didn't. Another neighbor of his, Kara Fowler, seemed to hold a darker view about him. She watched Matthew trap small animals in his yard and light fires on the lawn. She told the news that he was hunting and eating squirrels because he didn't buy any groceries. That might sound insane, but apparently crime scene investigators discovered a few unskinned squirrels along with red popsicles in the freezer, but very little else. His mother told the police that sometimes Matthew had mail sent to her address, but that he hadn't been living there since 2008. His own mother also described him as being a loner. Matthew Hoffman was, for the most part, friendless in those later years in life, but one friend of his said he was intelligent but lacked zero common sense. He was known for someone who loved taking risks. From something as simple as doing backflips off of picnic tables to crazier antics like stringing a towing strap between two trees in his yard and walking it as if it were a tightrope. One time, to the shock of onlookers, he ran back and forth underneath the undercarriage of a giant truck while it was in a parade. Matthew Hoffman lived for the rush. He was a thrill seeker, but nothing made him happier than trees. Trees were the center of his world, and it happened since he was young. He built himself a treehouse as a teenager. For fun and employment, he climbed trees. He tied ropes in them to swing, even inviting kids in the neighborhood to join him. This particular friend of his allegedly contacted the police and informed them that Matthew was highly strategic and that they should be looking for the bodies high up in the trees. A major focus of this case has been the offender's bizarre obsession with leaves. Dendrophilia is derived from the Greek word for tree, dendro, and philia for love, so it literally means the love of trees. In psychological circles, this term sometimes refers to a paraphilia, in which people are physically and emotionally drawn to trees. Some are even known to be sexually stimulated by them, although the extent to which they engage with nature varies by the individual. For some people, dendrophilia is not necessarily sexual at all, but rather represents a sincere respect for trees and a genuine desire to protect and nurture them. Some may even be called, or they refer to themselves as being tree huggers. They find a deep connection with, comfort, and peace being amongst nature. For others, it may be more of a fetish involving sexual contact in nature or even with nature. This can include physical contact with trees, plants, or in Matthew Hoffman's case, foliage. The appreciation and even worship of trees has been recorded in many ancient cultures. Some perceived trees to be symbolic of fertility, and sexual rites were performed with or amongst nature. Research has also been shown to have a strong correlation between positive mental health and nature. People who live amongst or spend more time with trees appear to be healthier in spirit, mind, and body. It can decrease feelings of anxiety, help minimize depression, and lower fatigue. To this date, there's been no formal research nor any case report done on dendrophilia. Matthew Hoffman's perceived obsession with nature, his leaf fetish, is not what I believe to be dendrophilia, at least not with the same elements others associate it with. Nature is synonymous with tranquility, balance, and respect for all living things. His actions were the polar opposite. To me, it seems like his passion for trees, his mass collection of their foliage, helped him to tune into the dark side of nature and thus the darkest layers of himself. I wonder, did it help him tune into the hunt of nature, the predatory behavior of animals in the wild when he was amongst the trees? It certainly didn't trigger a peaceful, loving side in him. So what happened between 2007 and November 2010 that potentially triggered this degree of depravity and violence in him that before then was never known or experienced? Only a few days before his 30th birthday, on November 1st, things seemed to be heading in an even worse direction for Matthew Hoffman's life. On October 24th, he and his then girlfriend got into an explosive argument. Things escalated into violence. She and her son moved out of the home, and she later accused him of choking her. Only a couple days after that, his supervisor fired him at Fast Eddie's, a company where he had a part-time job trimming trees. According to the supervisor, he was really creeped out by the guy, and he claimed that Matthew Hoffman was a liar about his extensive experience. Then Matthew's car was repossessed. His financial problems continued to pile up. Not only did he barely have enough money to make ends meet, but he had a massive amount of $2 million in restitution to pay for the arson damages to the townhome property back in Colorado. Allegedly during this time, his dog also ran away. Relationship problems, money problems, it all led to him snapping that day when he got caught in Tina Herman's residence. That is what many criminologists may say, that these triggers pushed him over the edge, as explained in what I would deem to be the most overused criminological theory, being strain theory. It essentially suggests that for some people who don't have appropriate coping mechanisms, the beginning or end of significant things in life build up and erupt into violence, even murder. It was recorded that people heard Matthew Hoffman crying in his jail cell the night he was captured. He threatened to kill himself, and deputies were tasked to keep an eye on him every 10 minutes. Matthew Hoffman appeared at his initial court hearing via a video link. He was dressed in what are known as suicide gowns as a safety precaution. Was this man who was so mentally broken and emotionally unstable that he wanted to end his own life after being faced with what he had done? Or was he an intelligent psychopath who was attempting to sell himself as something other than what he truly was? It was believed by some that he had intentionally targeted the family to take Sarah for his own depraved, sick pleasure. However, the prosecution didn't think this to be the case and instead painted the picture of a burglary having gone terribly wrong, resulting in a family massacre. Knox County prosecutor John Thatcher stated that Matthew Hoffman selected the house to burglarize it because it was isolated and there was an opening in the garage door. It was believed that he had committed a home burglary on a different house in the same county through the same method. When he was already inside, he was startled that there were people there. He snapped, not wanting to get caught. Not everyone believed this to be true. Mount Vernon Police Detective Craig Feeney, who led the search of Matthew Hoffman's residence, doesn't buy his confession letter, nor does Sarah and Cody's father, Larry Maynard, in addition to many of their family members and friends. There was evidence of possible premeditation of the murders in addition to the possibility that Matthew Hoffman was planning to leave town altogether. According to the items found during the search of his residence, Matthew Hoffman had a receipt from November 4th for a pair of Sure Grip gloves, the same kind of gloves that were left bloodied in the bathroom sink in the massacre at Tina Herman's home. He had bought the hunting knife online and had it on his person, even though he claimed his intention was only to burglarize the place and leave. A few days before the murders happened, he purchased duct tape and a different pair of gloves. Detective Feeney believes that maybe the over 100 bags of leaves there also held another purpose as a possible accelerant. The place was not at all cared for and appeared as if it were more of a squatter's house than someone's owned property. It was recorded during the search that some of the walls and door jambs were covered with scribblings and doodles like a teenage girl would have written on her notebook cover. There was a giant peace sign on the door, stars on the wall, random names written on marker. The leaf-filled bathroom had black doodles inside the white tub, including a jack-o'-lantern. All of these elements of his living space led Detective Feeney to believe that Matthew Hoffman was not planning on staying there long. It could also be reflective of a possible mental illness, whether it was schizophrenia or something else that he was likely inflicted with. I don't believe that Matthew Hoffman simply wanted to steal some things from the Herman residence. He got caught and decided on a whim to brutally slay 3 people, dismember them, place their bodies inside a tree, which he wanted to be able to visit as his trophy site. I don't understand why the prosecutor only saw this as a burglary gone wrong, as he said so in his written confession. It is obvious that he planned to rob the place, but he was not at all concerned about someone coming back and leisurely search the place. These are not the actions of someone who is merely motivated to burglarize a residence. It was almost as if he were biding his time until someone did return. Research shows that homicide during the commission of a burglary is extremely rare, and the method by which this offender killed these strangers makes this theory of his sole motivation being theft even less believable. Research on the relationship between different kinds of crime is even more relevant to the discussion regarding sexual violence. It is believed that sexual offenders tend to commit non-sexual or non-contact sexual offenses prior to committing any sexual offense or other more serious crimes. Of all the crimes committed, burglary is at the top of the offenses perceived as a strong predictor of future sexual violence. Initially, this doesn't make much sense. One is a property offense, whereas the other is violence against a person. But when you break down the elements and motivation of the offender, their similarities become much more transparent. Escalation from burglary to rape and multiple murders sounds illogical, even preposterous, but the data shows a surprisingly strong correlation between the 2 acts. Although sexual homicide is pretty rare, there are known precursor offenses associated with this kind of violent crime. These can include sexual assault, direct sexual activity with children, history of assault with intent to cause gross bodily harm, and arson. High potential for the escalation of non-sexual homicide has found the precursor offenses of wounding, with or without intent, robbery, aggravated burglary, and arson to be connected. In the case of Matthew Hoffman, his history of robbery, aggravated burglary, the assault on his ex-girlfriend, in addition to his arson offense, significantly increased the likelihood of him committing rape and murder. Research shows that there are shared motivations and behavioral patterns of a sexual predator and a burglar. They are both crimes of power and control. The main purpose is to invade, to take possession over something or someone, and the resulting thrill that is gained from the act. There is often a great deal of planning and premeditation involved in both offenses. There is the identification of a suitable target, and the process of avoidance of discovery. The prevalence of burglary in the criminal history of some of the most serious offenders, including serial killers, has led burglary to be perceived as a gateway crime toward sexual violence. Sexual murder has specifically been recorded as having strong ties with sexual burglary. One study conducted revealed that as high as 3/4 of serial sexual homicides were committed by offenders with a history of burglary. Of sexual offenders who committed rapes at the residences of their victims, it was observed that they were 5 times more likely to have had prior convictions for burglary than those who did not commit sexual violence within the victim's home. Sarah Maynard would tell her heartbreaking story to the prosecutor and the judge. According to Sarah, the following sequence of events unfolded that tragic day. She lost her mother and her little brother. The last time she saw her mom, Sarah and Cody had kissed her goodbye and told her they loved her before heading off to take the bus to school. They returned around 4 p.m. that afternoon. Sarah entered her home and saw a scene of horror. The walls were covered in blood. There was blood on the floors, and her mother was nowhere in sight. Then all of a sudden, a man came around the corner with a large, jagged hunting knife, dripping with blood. Sarah screamed and ran into her bedroom, closing the door. Then she heard her little brother Cody scream out, and then nothing but silence. Sarah was too terrified to move. Then the man pushed through her bedroom door, yielding the bloody knife. He grabbed her and held it to her chest, warning her that if she screamed, he would kill her. Sarah did as asked. The man tied her hands behind her back and blindfolded her. He picked her up, threw her over his shoulder, and into a vehicle. She lay in the car, petrified, as he drove erratically through the streets. Then suddenly the car stopped. He removed her blindfold and she was inside a house. Matthew pushed her down the steps of the basement and threw her into the hole. It was as dark as night inside, and the floor was covered in blankets, lying on top of an endless pile of leaves. Sarah said that on the 2nd or 3rd day she was kept down there, he raped her, holding the knife against her chest. At one point she asked him where her mother and brother Cody were, and he said that if she asked about that again, he would kill her. When Sarah Maynard faced this real-life monster in court, she looked him straight in the eye and stripped him of his power, telling him that she was no longer afraid of him. In a written statement read by the prosecution, Sarah Maynard spoke directly to Matthew, telling him how his actions had changed her whole life, and her family's too. She expressed disgust at him, saying, and I quote, "This is so sickening. Matthew, to know you even had the guts to do this to a family. What an amazing young girl to have found that kind of strength and courage to tell her offender, her rapist and murderer of her mom and kid brother, that she was sickened by him." Moments later, Matthew Hoffman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. How does a man convicted of arson and theft escalate to savagely murdering and then dismembering 3 innocent strangers, including a young boy, in addition to abducting and sexually assaulting a young girl? There was the complaint of a physical assault made by his ex-girlfriend, which does reflect not only his tendency for violence, but it may have been the unraveling point of his life. However, based on the criminal profiles of serial killers, there is almost always an escalation. Individuals don't go from committing burglary and arson to committing a brutal triple murder overnight. Matthew Hoffman was also not what anyone would have described as being a career criminal. He was a thief. He did commit arson. But he was mainly described as a weirdo, a loner, and someone who had great issues relating to others. Everything about this offender, from his modus operandi to his bizarre leaf fetish, in particular where he chose to dispose of the bodies, for him, creating the ultimate sacred trophy shrine. Screams serial killer. However, at least from what I could find regarding this investigation, the possibility was never even addressed, much less looked into. I have a difficult time believing that there aren't more bodies hidden amongst the trees. What are your thoughts on this brutal and disturbing case? Do you believe that Matthew Hoffman's actions were those of a man who freaked out, not wanting to get caught for burglary and return to prison? Or were they indicative of a premeditated psychopath who wanted to take his thrill-seeking behavior to the next level? Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, please reach out to me. I would love to hear from you. My contact information you can find in the episode description. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music, Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.